Frank Morrison discovered two bobcats nearly frozen to death, curled against an old shed. One of them was pregnant. The male had positioned himself protectively over his pregnant mate, both barely clinging to life. The female lifted her head just enough to look at him, a weak, pleading tilt that said more than words. If no one helped them now, it would be too late. As the storm worsened, the old man had to make a choice, not just to save two predators, but an entire family. He had minutes, maybe less. What happened next would test the line between caution and compassion and turn a quiet living room into a front-row seat to the wild's most fragile miracle. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The February blizzard came without mercy that year, sweeping down from the Canadian border into northern Montana with winds that could knock a grown man sideways. Frank Morrison had seen plenty of storms in his 73 years, but this one had teeth. He stood at his kitchen window, watching the snow pile against the barn, and knew he'd have to check on the horses before it got worse. Just the horses, he muttered to himself, pulling on his insulated coveralls. His wife Margaret would have laughed at him. Talking to himself had become a habit in the 3 years since she'd passed. Quick check, then back to the fire. The wind hit him like a physical thing when he stepped outside, driving ice crystals into every exposed inch of skin. He pulled his scarf higher and trudged toward the barn, his flashlight beam barely cutting through the white chaos. The horses were fine, huddled together in their stalls, munching hay as if the world wasn't trying to blow itself apart outside. But as Frank turned to leave, he heard something that made him stop. It was barely audible over the storm, a sound that didn't belong to wind or creaking timber. He stood still, straining to hear it again. There, a weak, almost plaintive cry from somewhere near the old equipment shed. Frank knew every sound his property made in weather like this, and this wasn't one of them. He fought his way through the drifts, following the sound to a hollow formed where an old tractor attachment created a windbreak against the shed wall. His flashlight beam swept across the snow, then stopped. Two bobcats lay curled together in the meager shelter, their fur crystallized with ice, bodies trembling violently. The larger one, a male by the look of him, had positioned himself to shield the smaller cat from the worst of the wind. Frank's breath caught. In all his years on this land, he'd seen bobcats only a handful of times, always from a respectful distance. These two were different. They didn't flee at his approach. They couldn't. The female lifted her head slightly, golden eyes meeting his with what looked impossibly like a plea for help. That's when Frank noticed her swollen belly, the telltale roundness that even the ice-matted fur couldn't hide. "Oh, Lord," he breathed. "You're carrying babies." The male tried to raise himself defensively as Frank approached, but collapsed back into the snow, his strength spent. Frank knew he had minutes, maybe less, before the cold claimed them permanently. Without overthinking it, overthinking had never been his strong suit anyway. He shrugged off his heavy barn coat and knelt in the snow. "Easy now," he said in the same tone he'd used with spooked horses for decades. "I'm not going to hurt you, but we need to get you somewhere warm." The female made a soft chirping sound, almost like surrender. Frank wrapped her carefully in one side of his coat, surprised at how light she felt despite her condition. The male resisted weakly as Frank gathered him up too, but seemed to understand that this human meant no harm. Or maybe he was just too far gone to fight anymore. The journey back to the house felt endless. Frank's arms ached with the weight of the two cats, and the wind tried to knock him down with every step. By the time he kicked open his back door and stumbled into the mudroom, he was gasping and shaking nearly as badly as his cargo. He didn't stop to catch his breath. These cats needed warmth, but not too quickly. Frank remembered reading somewhere that warming hypothermic animals too fast could send them into shock. He carried them to the living room and set them gently on the braided rug near the wood stove. Not too close, just where the heat would reach them gradually. His hands fumbled for the phone on the side table. Thank God he still had a landline. Margaret had insisted on keeping it for emergencies. He dialed the number for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks that was magnetized to his refrigerator, the one he'd never had cause to use before. "Wildlife emergency," he said when someone answered. "I've got 2 bobcats, nearly frozen. The female's pregnant. I brought them into my house." The voice on the other end, a woman named Dr. Sarah Whitfield, stayed remarkably calm as she walked him through the immediate steps. Warm them slowly. Offer water with a dropper or shallow dish if they could lap. No food yet? Their systems needed to stabilize first. Keep the room quiet and dim. Watch for signs of distress. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I need to be clear about something. These are wild animals, and they can be dangerous, especially when they're scared or protecting young." "Ma'am," Frank replied, watching as the male bobcat slowly uncurled himself to stay close to his mate. "These cats are barely alive. And even if they weren't, I buried my wife 3 years ago. I've got more life behind me than ahead. If helping these creatures is how I go out, there are worse ways." There was a pause. "We'll get to you as soon as the roads are passable. That might not be until morning. Then I'll sit with them until morning." And that's exactly what he did. Frank pulled his recliner closer to the cats and settled in for the long night. He warmed water on the stove and offered it from a coffee saucer, watching with relief as first the male, then the female, took tentative laps. He found some old towels in the linen closet, Margaret's good guest towels that hadn't been used since she died, and tucked them around the cats' bodies. As the hours passed and the warmth worked its magic, the cats began to show signs of recovery. The male, Frank had started thinking of him as guardian for the way he never moved more than a few inches from the female, lifted his head and fixed Frank with an intense amber stare. Not threatening exactly, but deeply assessing. "I know what you're thinking," Frank said softly. "Strange house, strange smells, strange old man talking to you. But you're safe here, both of you. All of you," he added, glancing at the female's swollen sides. The female, he'd begun calling her Grace because even half-frozen and pregnant, she moved with an elegant dignity, shifted position around midnight. Her breathing changed, becoming deeper and more labored. Guardian, immediately alert, moved closer to her, and Frank realized with a start what was happening. "Oh no, not now," he said, reaching for the phone again. But even as he dialed, he knew the reality. No one could get through this storm. Whatever was going to happen would happen here, in his living room, with just him as witness and, hopefully, help. Dr. Whitfield answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "I think she's going into labor," Frank said without preamble. "All right, Frank. May I call you Frank? Here's what you need to do. Give her space, but stay close enough to intervene if something goes wrong. Bobcat mothers are incredibly capable, but the stress and cold might have complicated things. Have clean towels ready. Keep the room warm but not hot. And Frank, just be there. Sometimes that's all we can do." What followed was one of the most remarkable nights of Frank's life. Grace labored through the small hours of the morning, with Guardian standing sentinel and Frank keeping quiet watch from his chair. He found himself talking to them in low, soothing tones, telling them about the ranch, about Margaret, about the time they'd rescued a whole litter of barn kittens in a storm not unlike this one. The first kitten arrived just as the wind began to die down, a tiny, blind creature that Grace immediately began to clean with fierce dedication. Then came another, and another. 5 in total, each one perfect despite their traumatic beginning. Guardian sniffed each kitten carefully, as if counting, then settled himself in a protective curve around his family. Frank watched it all with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. Life asserting itself against all odds. He'd seen it in calving season, in the spring garden after brutal winters, in Margaret's eyes during her last days when she'd squeezed his hand and told him to keep living. And now here, on his living room floor, in the bodies of wild creatures who'd trusted him in their darkest hour. Dawn came pale and exhausted, the storm finally spent. Frank had dozed in his chair, but woke to the sound of tiny mews. The kittens were nursing, their small bodies lined up against Grace's belly like keys on a piano. Guardian's eyes were open, watching Frank with what looked like gratitude, though Frank knew better than to anthropomorphize too much. The knock on his door came around 7. Dr. Whitfield herself stood on his porch, along with 2 other wildlife officers, their truck somehow having made it through the snow-choked roads. "Mr. Morrison?" She was younger than her phone voice had suggested, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "How are our patients?" Frank led them to the living room, where she stopped short at the scene. "Oh my, 5 kittens? And they all look..." She knelt slowly, professionally assessing from a safe distance. "They all look perfect. Mr. Morrison, this is remarkable." The next hour was a careful ballet of professional wildlife handling. Dr. Whitfield and her team had brought special carriers, heating pads, and medical equipment. They examined each cat with gentle efficiency, taking notes, checking vitals, looking for identification marks. "Frank," Dr. Whitfield said finally, her expression troubled. "These cats, they're not from around here. See this ear tattoo? These are captive-bred bobcats. Someone released them illegally, probably thinking they were doing something noble, giving them freedom. But captive-bred cats don't have the skills to survive in the wild, especially not in winter, especially not pregnant." Frank felt a surge of anger. Who would do something so foolish? We see it more than you'd think. People get exotic pets, realize they can't handle them, and instead of surrendering them properly, they dump them with some misguided idea about returning them to nature. These 2 would have died if you hadn't found them. They prepared the cats for transport with incredible care. Grace and the kittens went into one large carrier, lined with heated blankets. Guardian went into another, positioned so he could see and smell his family. Frank found himself following them out to the truck, reluctant to let them go. "What happens to them now?" he asked. "Quarantine first, to make sure they're healthy and the kittens are developing properly. Then we'll work on finding them placement in a proper facility, a zoo or wildlife sanctuary that can give them the care they need. They can't be released into the wild, not now. But they'll have good lives, Frank. Safe lives. Because of you." Frank nodded, his throat tight. Then he remembered something. "Wait," he said, hurrying back to the house. He returned with an old quilt, one Margaret had made years ago with a pattern of mountains and stars. "For their carrier. So they have something familiar, something that smells like safety. Dr. Whitfield took the quilt with the kind of reverence it deserved. "We'll make sure it stays with them." Frank watched the truck disappear into the white landscape, then went back to his empty house. The living room felt too quiet, despite the crackling fire. The depression in the rug where Grace had delivered her kittens seemed to hold more weight than it should. He sat in his chair and looked at the empty space, remembering. Over the following weeks, Dr. Whitfield kept her promise to stay in touch. She called with updates. The kittens were thriving, all 5 of them strong and growing. Guardian had been neutered and was recovering well. Grace was a devoted mother. They'd found a permanent home for the family at a wildlife education center in Billings, where they would live in a specially designed habitat and help teach people about bobcat conservation and the dangers of the illegal exotic pet trade. She sent photos too, pictures he printed out at the library and stuck to his refrigerator with Margaret's old magnets. Grace nursing her babies. Guardian standing proud. The kittens, eyes newly opened, exploring their quarantine enclosure with the curiosity of all young things. Spring came eventually, as it always does in Montana, sudden and glorious. Frank found himself thinking about the Bobcats often as he went about his ranch work. He'd given Dr. Whitfield his quilt for them, but she'd returned it after they were settled, saying Grace had used it to make a nest for the kittens but didn't need it anymore. It smelled faintly of wild animals and hope. One day in May, an envelope arrived with the Wildlife Department's return address. Inside was an invitation to visit the Bobcats in their new home at the education center. "They remember kindness," Dr. Whitfield had written in a note. "Guardian still watches for you, I can tell. And Grace has taught her kittens to trust carefully chosen humans. You should see what you saved." Frank made the drive on a Tuesday when the center was less crowded. Dr. Whitfield met him at the entrance and walked him to the bobcat habitat. A beautiful space with rocks and trees and a heated den, surrounded by viewing windows where school children could learn about these magnificent creatures. Guardian saw him first. The big male bobcat stopped mid-stride and stared, then made a sound Frank had never heard before, something between a purr and a chirp. Grace appeared from the den, followed by 5 half-grown kittens, all legs and spots and teenage awkwardness. "They recognize you," Dr. Whitfield said softly. "I've never seen them react this way to anyone." Frank stood at the glass for a long time, watching the family he'd saved explore their home. One of the kittens, the boldest, came right up to the window and put its paws on the glass, staring at Frank with eyes like golden coins. He placed his weathered hand against the glass where the kitten's paws were, remembering that terrible night. The storm, the fear, the miracle of birth on his living room floor. "Thank you," he whispered. The whether to the cats, to God, or to Margaret's memory for making him the kind of man who couldn't walk past suffering, he wasn't sure. On the drive home, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death, a sense of purpose fulfilled. He'd been a rancher all his life, had raised cattle and horses, had been a steward of the land in all the traditional ways. But this was different. This was about being in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, about being the kind of person who could see past the danger to the need, who could offer shelter in the storm. He thought about Guardian's protective devotion, Grace's fierce maternal love, the 5 small lives that existed because one old man had checked his horses on the worst night of the year. He thought about Dr. Whitfield and her team, about the education center, about all the children who would learn about wildlife conservation by watching the Bobcat family thrive. That night, Frank sat in his recliner by the fire, the quilt that had once wrapped wild cats now draped over his lap. The house didn't feel so empty anymore. It felt like a place where miracles had happened, where life had won against death, where kindness had made all the difference. He picked up the phone and dialed his daughter in Denver, whom he hadn't called in months. "Jennifer? It's Dad. I want to tell you about something amazing that happened here this winter. You're not going to believe it, but I've got pictures to prove it. It starts with a blizzard and 2 freezing bobcats." As he told the story, Frank realized that saving Grace and Guardian and their 5 kittens hadn't just saved them. In some profound way, he was only beginning to understand they had saved him too. They had reminded him that life insists on continuing, that love takes many forms, that even in the wildest storms, grace can arrive on 4 paws, carrying the future in its belly, trusting a stranger's kindness to make all the difference. The Bobcats thrived in their new home, became ambassadors for their species, and helped educate thousands of people about wildlife conservation. But for Frank Morrison, they would always be more than that. They would be the creatures who came to him in a blizzard, who trusted him with their most vulnerable moments, who reminded him that as long as there's breath in your body and love in your heart, you have something to offer the world. And sometimes, on cold winter nights, when the wind howled around his ranch house, Frank would look out at the swirling snow and remember. He'd remember Guardian's amber eyes, Grace's quiet dignity, 5 tiny mewing miracles, and the night when being in the right place at the right time with an open heart had been enough to change everything.